through. So as Rachel said, the first half of our session today, we'll be talking about what is an EdTech Makerspace. So an EdTech Makerspace, as we're talking about it, and what we're focusing on today is an initiative that's part of CrowdEd Learning. And CrowdEd Learning is part of World Education. And so what I want to do in the first part of our session talking about makerspaces is really getting into the nuts and bolts about what is an EdTech Makerspace. So as presumably you came here because you saw it in the title and read the description of what we're talking about. So I wanted to kind of drill down to specifically what it is and what makes a makerspace different from other types of professional development or other experiences you may have been a part of. So first and foremost, an EdTech Makerspace is service learning. It's also professional development with a purpose. And so what that means is the service learning component means is that we're engaging makers. So they're the participants as part of the makerspace in a lifelong learning opportunity. So this isn't just a training session where you come and you listen to a presentation and you go home and maybe you may or may not use the material that's covered. We're really trying to build new knowledge and skills. We're taking care of that as kind of building this culture of collaboration and contribution as part of the makerspace experience. So it really is an experience that extends through the duration of the cohort, about 6 weeks. And Rachel's going to take us through some examples of how we structure the different maker spaces. But what's really also a unique part of what we do is we embed research as part of the experience. So we're looking at the various processes and the various practices that occur within the makerspace and also the outcome of what the makers are working on. And so for the maker spaces that we put on, we've done many of them, which we'll highlight many of them in a moment, but they all are grounded in this idea of sparking interest in and then building skills to find, make, and use open educational resources. And tied with that, hand in hand, is this idea of integrating various EdTech tools to facilitate the use of and the creation and the use of the OER. So as I mentioned, when I started, I said this has the service learning foundation. And so some of you are probably familiar with what a service learning experience is, but from our perspective, we're really looking at these three components. There's the kind of academic coursework component to it. There's the applied learning. So folks are working on design challenges and specific projects. But then there's also this built-in community service that's also part of what we're doing. And so from a service side of things, the makers that are involved are curating and creating open educational resources, and everything we're doing is for the benefit of adult learners. So some of the subject matter that we may be working with and targeting, it might be civics education, digital literacy, financial literacy, health literacy, or workforce prep. Then on the learning side of things, whoops, excuse me, sorry about that. There we go. Sorry, find where we were. There we go. Sorry about that. So on the learning side of things, our makers are then gaining knowledge and the skills to then find, to evaluate, to adapt, or then create digital learning activities. So again, as OER, using existing resources that they may find on the internet. And so it could be free resources, it may be open educational resources. And then, as I said, integrating those various educational technologies. So from a facilitation standpoint, we really ground our work in what is termed situated learning, so situated experiential learning. And the three areas that we really drill down on as part of that, as part of our facilitation, is looking at ways that we can embed the work that the makers are doing in these problem-based challenges. So they're applying various educational practices, they're looking at real-world needs. So again, looking at the type of OER that's needed, the types of technology that may be used to support it. We're also grounding all the work in communities of practice. So these are cohorts of learners that work together for about 6 weeks. So they're working together on various types of projects. They're sometimes working on a project alone, but there's always then this peer-to-peer collaboration, feedback, and then strategy sharing that's happening all along through the process. And we also follow what's termed a cognitive apprenticeship model. So what this means is we have a team of subject matter experts, so subject matter experts in adult education, instructional design, educational technology who are guiding the experience of the makers throughout the whole process. So it could be through modeling, it could be through office hours where we're giving guided feedback. And then again, it could also just be working with fellow peers who maybe have more expertise in an area and they can share that knowledge with others. And so why the focus on OER for adult education? And so we really consider this like our call to action. So when you look at the research and from our own experience, we've found that about 90% of programs in adult education programs use free and open educational resources. And a big part of that is because these are small community-based organizations potentially, and they often lack funds to be able to purchase commercial educational products. And so what ends up happening is when you go out to the internet and you look for resources, a lot of times those resources are not designed for educational purposes, or they're designed for a different context. So maybe K-12 or higher education. And so it's not necessarily something specific to adult learners. And then tied with all of that, a lot of times the teachers that work in these programs are working part-time, they may be volunteers. And so they also then need professional development to be able to find these OER and then to be able to create them and use them as well. And so this is how we're tackling some of the big barriers to OER adoption and use. So these are common to programs outside of ours. Anybody who's familiar with working with OER will probably recognize some of these barriers as I go through them. But first and foremost is discovery. So there's tons of OER that's out there, tons of free resources, but that abundance can make it really hard to find relevant resources. So a big part of what we do is curate the resources to make sure that they're aligned to the specific topics and skills that are relevant to adult education. Kind of hand in hand with that, the resources you do find on the internet, you can't always tell the quality. And so it may be a resource that's not necessarily from a reputable source, or as I mentioned, it may not be necessarily an educational resource in that it is a resource that provides information, but it doesn't necessarily support learning. And so we spend a lot of time working with our makers to evaluate resources and look at things such as the credibility, the learning support features that are present, accessibility features, and things like that. And then the resources you find on the internet may work for the folks who created it, but when you go to take it and adapt the resources, there may be maybe design choices or technology choices that were made at the time that that resource was made that makes it difficult for someone else to be able to pick up and use it for their needs. And so as we're creating resources and as we're adapting them, we're really looking at those usability considerations. So is it the content licensing? Is it the technology choices that were used? And tied in with that is this idea of localization. So someone creates a resource that's needed and applicable for their context, and they were nice enough to share it out to the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to be able to pick it up and work on it with my learners. It may be in a different language, it may be for a different age group. And so what we really focus on within creating our resources is this idea of reusability to support adaptation for diverse contexts. That's really a big point that we reinforce throughout our experiences. Another big barrier for us is program level barriers. So this might be a lack of incentives for our educators to spend the time creating the resources. It's time consuming. They may not get time for prep to do that. They may have knowledge gaps, or they may just have a preference to use an off-the-shelf commercial product. And so we're trying to make this easier for educators. And so we're supporting our educators in the use of OER. And then also, as I said, blending in this idea of then how we could use professional development as part of this process to kind of get through some of these barriers in terms of knowledge and preference for using OER. And last but not least, even though these are free resources we're talking about, it's not free to create them or to store them. And so our kind of community service aspect of our work then really boils down to this idea of facilitating the curation and creation through our maker spaces. And then we also have another project that Rachel's going to talk about in a second, is what we do to store these resources and how we make them available for teachers to use with their learners, which is a product called Skill Blocks. And so Rachel, you want to take us through that?
Absolutely. So SkillBlocks works hand in hand with the EdTech Maker Space as part of our crowded learning initiative. The EdTech Maker Space is our process for generating resources and engaging teachers and making them aware of OER. And Skillblocks is our platform or our tool for actually delivering that OER. So Skillblocks is a free application. It's a free tool to teachers, and what it contains are free and open resources that teachers can easily find and then organize into Skillblocks, which is essentially a collection of linked instructional materials that they can share with learners. Through Skillblocks and really through everything that we're doing, we are promoting equity through the widespread use of OER. And so we really are aiming to raise awareness and usability of OER in order to work toward equity in education. So kind of getting more into the actual tangible ways that we do this. There are 3 key activities that we engage makers in. The first is resource evaluation. And the idea behind that is to have teachers evaluate existing OER in order to empower them to choose and use OER in their practice, and B, gather information about OER that we can then more broadly share with educators so that when they go to use a resource, they can make an informed decision about when and how they might use it. And then there's activity creation. And in activity creation in the makerspace, we are designing or sometimes adapting openly licensed activities. And our hope here is to contribute to the body of well-designed OER that helps others have access to OER and adapt it for their own use. And then finally, there's activity alignment. And in this process, we have makers aligning OER to frameworks so that other users can then see where the OER will fit into their instruction. And so that gets at that localization and organization of OER so that teachers can more easily access it. And when we align it, we are putting it into Skillblocks, and it's organized in there according to the framework so that it's easier to retrieve. So a couple of even more tangible examples of these activities. Like Jennifer said, everything that we do is kind of problem-based or driven by a specific need. And in our first project, the need was accessible, mobile-friendly reading materials at early literacy levels for distance learning. So this was during the pandemic, and teachers needed to be able to deliver reading materials and reading practice activities at a distance. And so what we did during that makerspace was engage teachers in the creation of Quizlets, Wakelets, and Google Forms. And so they were taking some supplemental activities that already existed and are OER and adapting those activities using EdTech tools to then be able to share more flexible resources and materials with their learners that would suit the needs of the pandemic, but now even just general use for education. So we had 44 participating teachers in that project, and the result was the Marshall Leveled Reading Program, which is an app that learners can access. It's a free app. You can go to the next one, Jennifer. It's a free app with all of those supplemental activities baked into it. And so learners can go into the app, they can practice the vocabulary, read the passage, and check their understanding. And of course, that aligns with those EdTech tools, right? Quizlet, Wakelet, and Google Forms. So we put those all together into the Marshall Leveled Reading Program. And in addition to the app, which learners can use and track their progress, we also shared out a spreadsheet and a lot of other resources that were specifically for teachers, so that teachers can take everything that's in the app and reuse it and adapt it to their context so that they are getting the results from learners and so forth. And so we have in mind, of course, filling the need, but also ensuring that the resources that result are accessible and adaptable for all. Another project that we did after the Marshall Level Reading Program was meant to fill the need for digital skills resources. And so we know that there has been, especially during the pandemic, an increased interest and need for resources that teach essential digital literacy skills. And in order to fill that need, what we recognized was not so much that we needed to create or adapt things, but more so that we needed to curate things and put them all in one place where teachers could access them, because there was already a lot of content being developed and that had been developed. And so what you see here is that there were different sites that offered different formats. And so we felt if we could gather all of that together and curate it and align it to specific digital skills, like the one you see at the top, get an email account, then we're giving teachers a place where they can grab those materials, know how to use them, in other words, with which skill to use them, but then also have flexible options that suit the needs of diverse learners. So the Makerspace was all about curating those resources. So we took those well-known sites of free and open resources, Learn My Way, GCF Learn Free, digitallearn.org, and the WISC Online MOOC, among many others. And we aligned those to an aggregate framework of digital skills. And that was just our way of engaging the makers so that they could get to know digital skills better, get to know the framework better, get to know the resources better, but then also participate in that service of putting it all together for other teachers to use down the road. And what that resulted in was our digital skills library. So the digital skills library is at digitalskillslibrary.org. And when you go to digitalskillslibrary.org, you can actually, next slide, you can actually go and do an open search for any keyword like email or settings and so forth, or you can navigate it by digital skills domain like communication, creation, gateway skills, etc. And you can find different activities within. You can also submit a new activity, which is part of our ongoing building of this ecosystem, right? Giving people a way to actually contribute to the tools that they're using. And then we also just wrapped up a project in which we built a digital skills glossary, which is now on digitalskillslibrary.org. So it is an output of a couple of maker spaces that continues to grow as we keep diving into how to make digital skills instruction more accessible to teachers. In addition to adapting, so that first example I talked about was largely just adapting things that already existed. And then the second example I talked about was curating and harnessing things that are already out in the world. We also do design slams. And the idea behind that is that not all of the OER that's needed already exists, right? And we want to leverage teachers' creativity in the maker spaces to create original designs that could fill a need or a gap in OER. So we did a project around a health literacy curriculum. That's the image that you're seeing on the slide right now is of a PDF of that curriculum called Staying Healthy. And in that makerspace, we actually leveraged templates that were created in a design slam. And so the idea of a design slam is giving teachers a little bit of knowledge around the tools, around designing for reusability, and seeing what they come up with. And what they came up with in this case were many templates for vocabulary practice that we ended up using in future maker spaces. So what you're seeing in the middle there are the templates that were created during a design slam, which we then applied to the Staying Healthy maker space so that we could generate more vocabulary sets to go along with that curriculum. And then in the Staying Healthy makerspace, we had them engage in design, and they went on to create some really original, creative OER just by being given that platform and time to do it. So it was really, really fruitful activity that ended up with a lot of resources born out of the creativity of the makers. So I wanted to share, because all of this is very exciting, but also a lot of different components coming together. I wanted to share just a couple of our the things that we do for facilitation of the makerspaces and some of our tips and lessons learned. So when it comes to recruitment, we focus on giving the background of the project or of the makerspace, the goals, of course, and then sharing the logistics with potential makers. A couple of lessons learned there is to always share what the learners will learn and make, right? Because you have makers coming, some for the learning of ed tech tools or OER, and some for the pure contribution piece where they know that they're contributing to their field, right? So you want to recruit and always share those two key messages. This is what you'll learn, and this is what you're contributing to. Of course, use established channels for outreach. Find where the teachers already are to access them. Like they're not on Twitter. No, I'm not saying that definitively, but in our experience. And then of course, we've also found that the more time that we have for recruitment, the better off we are in terms of getting a lot of engaged makers. For training and management, we use forms to gather information about the makers. We use a learning management system. We use Google Classroom, which I know doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but it works perfectly for our EdTech Maker Spaces. We use that just to manage the participants and to share resources with them and track their progress. And then we also utilize a lot of blended learning. And so it's a lot of coming together and using our synchronous time to collaborate and to chat, and then using our asynchronous time to plug away at some tasks and do any offshoot independent learning that the makers might be interested in. So what we found here, strategic planning about how you're going to use that synchronous time versus the asynchronous time. We tend to have an around 6-week duration of the EdTech Makerspace. So that extended duration is really important for the ongoing growth. And then collaboration. The makers love to collaborate with one another and learn from one another. So that's a really key part of the makerspaces. And then finally, for giving feedback and wrapping up the project, and really making sure that we're validating the work that the makers have done and the skills that they've acquired. We make sure to build in a lot of peer and facilitator feedback opportunities throughout the makerspace. We administer certificates for everyone who participates. And then we also have a badging system that will end up giving credentials for the skills that the makers have acquired throughout the EdTech Makerspace. So don't take our word for it. The makers have spoken. We have gotten a lot of great feedback about the EdTech Makerspaces from all ranges of skill levels. So you can see the one on the left says, if a digital illiterate can learn as much as I did, then I recommend this type of instruction to anyone. We are very welcoming. Our door is open to all makers of all skill levels. Because it's so collaborative, there's a lot of opportunity for peer learning and just to accommodate different levels of skills. And we've also heard that people love earning the badges. They can put those on LinkedIn or in their email signatures. And that's just kind of a way of, in addition to the service and the learning, it's an added perk to their volunteerism. And then in the third one, you can kind of see that this maker felt that they were walking away with the knowledge, right? So that learning piece and access to amazing content. So it's kind of that twofold thing that we're going for, where makers walk away with more skills, knowing more about what's out there, and then also just walk away with something they can implement right away in the classroom. So we are building a maker map. We just started building this. I want to say it was in the fall, last fall. So it's very exciting. We're having makers kind of drop a pin on the map and share a little bit about what they've learned and what they've contributed to in the maker spaces. I would love for you to just take a glance and see all of the amazing makers that have fueled the generation of some really incredible open education resources. And I want to share as well that we have written a design and facilitation guide. We really believe that this is a model that can be replicated, and we want to see others do that. I myself was first a maker, then a makerspace facilitator, and now I don't know what you would call me, a makerspace won't go away from the makerspaces. But basically what I did is I participated, and I thought it was such a cool way to engage in professional development and create resources. So I facilitated one for my own professional learning network. So there's a guide. Please check it out. And if this is something that you're interested in, it could be a great tool for you to kind of go through the different steps of designing your own makerspace. We also have on our website some examples of the resources that we've generated. We are in the process of getting them all into the SkillBlocks platform, but there are plenty of them that are on our website and are ready to be used. So definitely check those out as well. Our website is crowdedlearning.org, and we also have a social media presence on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. So if you want to follow us there, we share updates about events and resources of the month and so forth. So I hope you will consider following us and getting in touch with us. Okay,